that evil exists in the world and that it has to be stopped before it comes back to haunt us is in fact the root of many of our current problems. It is the root of our failure to deal with Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, where we dismissed one terrorist bombing after another as a pinprick strike that was not worthy of a serious response from the United States because we failed to recognize the evil that was out there and the great forces that were mobilizing against this. And we paid a very high price on 9/11 of 2001 for that failure to recognize that evil exists in the world and it is coming to get us. I hope that we will wake up to the greater evils that continue to exist in the world, including from Al-Qaeda, but also from regimes like North Korea that continue to threaten us. And frankly, people object to the use of the word evil for some reason, but it's hard for me to find a more accurate description of a regime like the one in Pyongyang, which has literally starved millions of its people, has put hundreds of thousands of people in slave labor camps. If that's not evil, what is? If there is any regime in the world today that resembles the Nazi regime, it has to be the one in North Korea. And if you can't call them evil, then I don't know what would qualify for that label.
Returning to the Iraq War, what is your reflection upon the positioning of the war as the search for WMD and the current state of that search?
Well, obviously, the whole WMD has been a huge embarrassment for the administration. Now, I think that the wilder charges that the administration, quote-unquote, politicized intelligence for its own ends have not been proven at all. In fact, this notion that Iraq did have a vast WMD arsenal was held not only by the Bush administration, it was also held by the Clinton administration, it was held by France, Russia, Germany, various states that did not support our military action in Iraq. Everybody believed that Saddam did have this vast arsenal because Saddam wanted us to believe it. He refused to come clean. He gave strong hints that he had these weapons. It's possible that it was a giant bluff. At this point, I don't think we know exactly what happened. We certainly know that he was trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction. We know he was trying to acquire ballistic missiles from North Korea. We know that he certainly had the capability to manufacture chemical weapons, biological weapons. We know that he had used chemical weapons in the past. I think the real question now is what was the state of his actual inventory? But in terms of whether or not he had a program to manufacture and acquire weapons of mass destruction, I think that's indisputable.
Mr. Boot has a book in the marketplace, if you're interested, called The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power, published by Basic. And my notes say that you're in progress on a new book. What's that about?
The new book is basically a look at revolutions in military affairs over the past 500 years. It's called War Made New, 4 Great Revolutions That Changed the Face of Battle in the Course of History. It's basically an attempt to put our current information revolution, its impact on warfare, into historical perspective by looking at similar revolutions over the past 500 years that have changed the way that war is fought and also changed the international balance of power. That's a book I'm working on now, and that'll be out probably in about 3 years or so.
All of our discussion about the definition of and influence of neocons have focused on foreign policy. Is that the focus of neoconservatives?
That's a good question, Susan. I would not say that is the focus of neoconservatives because a lot of people who are identified as neocons are not primarily interested in foreign policy, and I'm thinking in particular of people like Bill Bennett or Father John Newhouse or Michael Novak or others. In fact, many of the issues with which neocons were associated in the 1970s were not foreign policy issues. They were often domestic issues about the culture wars at home, about the curriculum at universities, those kinds of issues. I think what's happened over the past 20 or so years is that a lot of those domestic concerns of neocons have been amalgamated into the mainstream conservative movement, so they're not that different from what most conservatives are talking about. I think the main area where there is an identifiable neocon wing right now is in foreign policy, where I think neocons place a greater emphasis on promoting democracy and American ideals abroad than do traditional interest-based Republicans like Henry Kissinger or Brent Scowcroft or Jim Baker.
For Max Boot, next Little Rock, you're on the air.
Thank you. I've been waiting quite some time. Matter of fact, give my version of the neocons. Richard Pearl, Wolf Rich, Bill Kristol, and several others of the neocons. And matter of fact, you can really throw Rumsfeld in as a neocon to a certain degree. Now, you made a mention a few minutes ago about Rice and Powell. Powell takes orders for the neocons. They are on the receiving ends from the neocons. Matter of fact, one lady caller made one caller, I think was a man, made a statement a few minutes ago, and the statement was this: the neocons really got us into this war. They are the biggest situation that got us into this war. And this one thing is this, that you sit there and you talk. Matter of fact, you talk about, never say anything about Israel. Israel is the biggest threat to this country and to the world. Matter of fact, if you notice one thing, that Ariel Sharon went to England, he went to Russia, he went to France. He got no consideration. Only consideration he got was from this country. But the point is this, we are victims of the neocons until we get our heads together and get our minds together and throw these neocons aside, we'll be in trouble the rest of our cotton-picking life. Thank you.
Anything for him?
You know, it's just a bunch of ad hominem insults. As I tried to make clear, I don't see how you can really argue this. President Bush is not a neocon, okay? He has never been associated with the Weekly Standard, commentary, the public interest. There's no way that you could possibly label him a neocon. If there's one person who made the decision to go to war in Iraq, it was President Bush, okay? He makes the decisions in this administration. He has not been captured by second-level officials in the administration. That's just nonsense. Now, let me address the caller's other point, which is this vicious slurring of Israel, which he claims is the biggest threat that we face, which is, you know, a monstrous thing to say, considering the fact that we confront real dangers like al-Qaeda that have killed over 3,000 Americans on one day alone. Israel is not only not threatening the United States, it's one of our greatest allies. It's a bastion of liberalism and democracy in the Middle East. It's one of the few countries that respects basic civil rights in the Middle East. It's the only country that gives Arabs the right to vote in meaningful elections in the Middle East. So the notion that Israel is somehow this huge threat to the United States is just a grotesque distortion of the truth, which is that Israel is one of the best friends that America has in the whole world.
Mr. Booth, since we're getting into a presidential election year, which by many accounts so far, turnout is going to be an important factor, are neocons part of the policy community alone, or are there voters around the country who identify themselves as neoconservatives who will be making decisions about whether or not to support this president this year?
Yeah, I'm surprised, Susan, you haven't heard about that vast neocon block out there. I mean, I'm surprised Howard Dean isn't out wooing the neocons on the street corners of New Hampshire. No, seriously, you know, neocon refers to a group of basically public policy intellectuals. It's not a movement that has a vast grassroots constituency, nor does it seek one. It's basically a bunch of thinkers and writers who are promulgating their ideas. Now, I think a lot of the ideas with which neocons are associated are actually very popular. People may not think of themselves as neocons, but basically the views that neocons espouse, such as that America is a great country, it has to be defended, we should promote our ideals abroad, we should not cut unnecessary deals with dictators who claim to support us, we should get tough with regimes that make war on us. I mean, those basic ideas are in fact very popular. They're ideas that win wide consensus among the American people, aside from maybe the 20 or 30% who are supporting Howard Dean out there. So I think that certainly there is a constituency that for which neocon ideas have great appeal, but the actual neocon label or thinking of themselves as neocons, that's not what ordinary people think of themselves as. And in fact, I have to confess, I don't really think, I mean, I'm a little hesitant even to identify myself as a neocon because, as I say, I'm not a new conservative. I've always been a conservative. I mean, I've sort of reluctantly accepted the label because it's been placed on me so many times, but I don't think a lot of people are rushing to identify themselves as neocons.
Long Island next. Go ahead.
I think you're going to consider this another ad hominem insult. I would call neocons chicken hawks and war profiteers. My opinion of you, the way I see you, is a bunch of nerds who play this little Dungeons and Dragons game with world affairs. How much money has Richard Pearl made off of this foreign policy? How many of you have ever been in the military? How large a military is needed to back up your policies? And will we need a draft in order to enforce these policies?
Again, you know, as the caller correctly predicted, I'm going to label that as more ad hominem posturing with very little real substance. Now, let me try to address the substantive points that you raised about the military. In fact, I think we do need a larger military. This is something that neocons, and especially the Weekly Standard, have been arguing for a number of years, that our current military, which was downsized tremendously during the 1990s, is not large enough for all the tasks that we face today. When you consider that the Army went from 18 divisions in 1990 to 10 divisions today. That's not adequate given all the responsibilities that have been thrust our way. But those responsibilities have come about not because of a neocon conspiracy, but because we face huge and real threats in the world. People like Al-Qaeda who are out there actively every day plotting to kill Americans, and we have to do something about it. Unfortunately, our current military is not large enough to do the task. I don't think that we need to institute a draft. That's not necessary. It would actually be counterproductive for military efficiency because our professional all-volunteer force is the most superb military that we've ever fielded, and getting a bunch of ill-trained draftees in there would not improve their military efficiency. What we do need to do is to expand back to the size force that we had at around 1990. Which means adding back a number of active duty Army divisions in particular, and there's a move on the Hill to do that. I've been very mystified and disappointed that Secretary Rumsfeld and President Bush have not been willing to push for that policy. They've even, in the early years of the administration, they even talked about downsizing the military, which would have been horribly irresponsible, but now they're calling on the reserves of the National Guard to fill the gap instead of getting more active duty soldiers to deal with some of the problems that we face, and which is something I think they need to step up to. But that's a real challenge that we face. It doesn't require a draft. It just requires expanding the size of the volunteer force.
You might be surprised to know that your concern about the use of the thinning of the Army in deployments is shared by the editorial page of the New York Times today. But their solution is more multilateralism. They say the blame is that the damage done by the White House unilateral course inflicting on the Army, and urges them to change the course before the damage becomes harder to undo.
That's wishful thinking. It would be great if we could get our allies to step forward and fight our battles for us. It would be terrific if we didn't have to have 130,000 troops deployed in Iraq, if somebody else would deploy 130,000 troops there, but unfortunately, nobody is volunteering. In fact, a lot of nations in Europe have made contributions, but relatively modest ones, and a lot of that has to do not with so much with anti-Americanism, but with lack of military capability. If you look at Afghanistan, which is a place where NATO has taken on responsibility for the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul, they have not been able to expand it beyond Kabul as they promised to do, simply because they don't have the resources. In fact, at a recent NATO meeting, Lord Robertson, who was the outgoing NATO Secretary General, asked his members to contribute a few helicopters so that his peacekeepers would have some helicopters to move around in Afghanistan. And it was almost impossible to even get a few helicopters out of them. The European militaries are very weak. They spend very little money on defense. They have a lot of them still have conscript armies which cannot be deployed abroad. So there's a huge lack of military capability among our allies, so that even if they were willing to help us out in a place like Iraq, they couldn't do it. They are willing to help us out in Afghanistan, and even there they're not able to do very much. So this notion that we can somehow, through multilateral diplomacy, get others to carry our military burden for us, I wish it were true, and I hope it will be true someday, but it's just not true right now.
Do you put France in that category?
France has one of the better militaries in Europe, but it's very tiny compared to that of the United States. France and Britain have the largest, most deployable militaries in Europe, but even they have very limited resources, and they're already strained because France is already committed, for example, to peacekeeping in the Ivory Coast as well as Afghanistan. They don't have a lot of resources left over for a place like Iraq, even if they wanted to go there.
San Diego, good morning to you.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, I've been a liberal Democrat most of my life, and I have to say with the war issue in the Iraq and Palestine, the whole thing, I'm feeling like a neocon myself. And I really feel like, you know, the Democrats and the people around the world who are saying that this is an unjust war and illegal war and all of this are out of their minds. I mean, you know, when you look at the history, America's totally justified, you know, if we were Romans, in destroying these places. And, you know, the Middle East has sided with the Soviets in the past. They, you know, they have this duplicitous, you know, culture. And, you know, there's really no time for having, you know, these you know, little dictators around the world acquiring nuclear weapons. It could not only, you know, threaten America, but it threatens the whole world at this point because, you know, the Earth is relatively full. And, you know, when it comes to a place like China, you know, it's more like Taiwan should be taking over China because they're taking too long. They have to admit that communism is a failure, and they need to have a two-party system over there. And, you know, we're trying to win them over I guess the way we, through economic means, put every Chinese person in a pair of Levi's and they'll change is the philosophy. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Well, I'll see if I can get a neocon conspiracy card issued to you as